Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Reason Town. This one, episode 21. I am one of your hosts, Murphy Randall, and this is your other host,
Jared Forsyth. Glad to be here.
We're glad to be with you today, and we are trying something new and different today, which is a screencast, a screen recording of a screencast, and we're trying to narrate as we're screencasting with each other so that this can be consumed over both video for visual education and over audio so that if you're driving in the car or cleaning the toilet or whatever, you can still learn along with us. So today what we're going to be doing is going over a new PPX that Jared has written. Not that he's ever written any PPXs before. I say sarcastically because he's the king of PPXs. He wrote a PPX for writing templates so that you don't have to learn to write a PPX to write your own PPX, if that makes sense.
Right. We should say PPX a couple more times.
Yeah, if only I could find a way to fit them in. For those of you who don't know what a PPX is, it is the method that the compiler gives us to extend the compiler with our own custom compilation rules. So there are certain syntax areas where the compiler will allow us to reach out to a binary that we've written by hand to transform the source before it's written into binary or into bytecode. So PPXs are great. We've talked about them a lot before on this show, but today we're going to talk about a PPX Jared wrote to allow more user-friendly template writing, basically. Jared, do you want to give us a little more background on why this came about?
Sure.
Oh, wait, pause. I totally forgot the sponsors. So sorry, everyone. Sorry, Jared. Today, our hosting is sponsored by TylerMcGinnis.com, the linear course-based approach to learning web technologies. Thank you very much, Tyler McGinnis. And by Day One, the company I work for. We love Day One, and we are grateful to Day One for letting me use company time to do this podcast. And Jared works for Khan Academy, which we love too.
Right. Also, Tyler McGinnis just recently came out with a massive course on React and React with hooks.
That's right.
And he's an excellent teacher. Super happy to have him sponsor the show.
So if you want to get down with a new React hotness, go ahead and go to TylerMcGinnis.com.
Yeah. All right. So now with the reason macros. So PPXs, like you said, are for extending the syntax or extending the compiler behavior. Very similar to Babel plugins and Lisp macros. These kind of things where basically you write a program that will transform one version of the code into another version of code. And then you hand that back to the OCaml or BuckleScript compiler to turn that into JavaScript or into native.
And there are lots of languages that support this, right? I mean, like C++ comes to mind, has had templates forever.
Right.
And template Haskell is a thing. And also Rust is kind of what inspired you with the system, right?
That's right. I'm really impressed with Rust's system of doing template macros because Rust also has what they call procedural macros, which are very similar to PPXs. You get the AST, you're messing with the abstract syntax tree of the code, but they have a simpler system which they call, I think, macro by example or program by example, something like that. And it is you write code, but then you have a couple of substitute places and you say, just plop this in here and put this in here. So you don't even have to be messing with, oh, what kind of a syntax node is this? You just write the code that you want to see with a couple of substitutions and it gets the job done.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And so like you said, I've written a bunch of PPXs. When I come across a thing where I'm like, the language doesn't really do it for me, I want something simpler or to hide some complexity that I think is just getting in the way. And several times when I've come out with one of these PPXs, somebody says, "Oh, this is so awesome! I want to learn how to do a PPX. Can you show me? Like, are there any good tutorials? Are there any good ways to get started?" And it's really hard to do.
Yeah, the answer is no, right?
Right. There are some tutorials. I've done a little bit of screencasting, writing PPXs, but it is it's kind of a brutal experience because it's very complex. There are a lot of acronyms, a lot of just terms that you've got to keep in your head, and you've got to be visualizing the structure of the code, all this stuff. It's just a very complex process.
And then the programming task itself is computationally rigorous, and not computationally in the sense that like your brain has to be able to understand the algorithms of transforming an abstract syntax tree, which aren't that simple, I don't think.
Exactly.
Anyway, yeah.
So people say, hey, I would love to learn this, and I'm like, I want to teach you, but I also don't, because it's such a painful thing to do. I don't want to wish this on you. And so just for the past several years, I've had this idea in my head of, Rust has this macro by example set up. It would be so nice to do that in Reason, and maybe cover the 80% case of most of the things that you want to get done. And then the last 20% can be, messing with the abstract syntax tree directly.
Perfect. Well, it sounds like it's not just a dream anymore.
That's right. So actually, after our last recording session a couple of weeks ago, we were talking something about this, and I mentioned that I wanted to make something like this, and I sat down and was like, it shouldn't be that hard, and so that's been my pet project the past couple of weeks.
That's pretty amazing. So let's see what you did. I'm really excited to see how this has come out. Is this in a usable state? Like it's not published yet, right?
It is not. It has not been publicized yet. So we're going to link to a web URL where you can go and play with this in a code mirror editor at the end. And there's also I published today an npm package that will allow you to do this in your BuckleScript code today. There are some little gotchas about how it works and how it integrates with BuckleScript. But it should be doable.
Okay, great. Well, then let's get started. So you've got your code editor up here for those who are just listening. Jerry's got his code editor up in front of me, and he has two tabs open. They're both called hello.re. On the left side, we've got some source, and on the right side, it looks like the source, but expanded and rewritten. Is that right?
That's right. So using the feature of Reason VS Code, where you can say, show the fully PPX source for this file. So show me what happens after you've run all of the preprocessors on this. What is the code that comes out the other end?
Great. Okay. So over on the left-hand side, what's the first thing you're going to show us?
A very simple macro that really should just be a function, but it'll hopefully serve our purposes. And we're using the let% macro token to say this is, we're defining a new macro. We give it a name, add 5.
Great.
And it takes an integer, and then it returns a little chunk of code, which is the input integer plus 5.
And this is literally just a function definition. Like it's let macro, like you said, let% macro to say that we're defining a macro, but what follows is just a function definition. You got input type int, and then a fat arrow, and on the right-hand side of the fat arrow is a body of a function.
That's right. And so a couple of special things and then the next line we have is using that macro. So
Okay.
let some number equals, and now we're going to call the macro using the square brackets, the %, and then add 5, which is the name we gave it.
Now, can you tell me about that? What is that syntax called? I always feel like it's awkward to type, and I also don't know what to call it, but it's a square bracket, %, some symbol, then a space, and then some expression, and then a square bracket again.
That's right. This is the extension points syntax.
Okay.
And extension points meaning this is the OCaml syntax has defined this section of code or this type of token to mean some preprocessor is going to replace this.
This entire thing, everything that's inside the square brackets.
That's right.
Okay.
And in fact, if you're somehow have your build setup misconfigured so nothing comes through and replaces this, it's a compiler error.
Okay.
So if I change this to add 4, I get an error that says uninterpreted extension add 4.
Great.
Something was supposed to deal with this and it didn't.
That makes sense. So when we're doing buckle script, there are some things here we do like %bs.raw, and that means that buckle script has some built-in PPXs that take the content, the expression that's inside of that, and transforms it using buckle script specific stuff.
Exactly.
Great.
So interesting things about this. When you're working with macros, the type system has not run. This all happens before OCaml's type system happens. So for example, if I wanted to use a variable and then use that variable in here, that's going to be an error because we don't, I declared input to be an integer, and that means an integer constant.
Okay. So what Jared has done is he's just taken that square bracket syntax with add 5, where he was calling his macro from before. He has add 5 space 15, just an integer constant right now. So he's calling add 5 with the value 15, and he swapped that out for a variable that was called like number, right? And then that was assigned to the value 15. And he said that doesn't work because
I declared the macro to take an integer, and that means it has to be a constant because the type system hasn't run to tell me that this variable is an integer.
Interesting. Okay.
So now, of course, if I don't declare it to be an integer, then it's assumed to be an expression, and then that's fine.
It just works.
It just works.
Interesting. Okay.
But I won't be able to do pre-evaluated math because, again, the macro doesn't know, the macro system doesn't know what the value is, and so it won't be able to work with it.
So that would be a runtime thing. It just drops in that function basically as a replacement instead of evaluating the result of the function.
Yeah, it drops in. So the result is num plus 5 instead of 15 plus 5, which we had before.
Okay, I see. So now what if you did ++5, or I don't know, what if you did something that was a syntax error here? Not a syntax error, but like number is 15. What if number were a string? Sorry, not ++. So if you put it back to what it was, where you're taking the eval input and you're adding 5, and then take num and you convert it to a string, yeah, will you get a compiler error?
Yes, you will. And so it is saying, you passed in add 5 with hello, which is this input variable, and this has now been determined to be a string by the type system, but it's supposed to be an int because you're adding it.
Because it's already done the syntax transform, and now the type system is running.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
So another funny thing about here is instead of input, I'm doing eval __ input.
Okay. Oh, interesting. So yeah, for listeners, the argument name is input, and then the argument reference in the body is eval __ input.
Right. And this is how anytime you see eval in the macro system, it means I am this is going to be evaluated at macro time and not later on in the compiler's
so that's
setup.
part of your macro system. That's part of what
Yes.
you wrote. Okay, great.
If I just do input, then we're going to get a different error, which is
that's an ugly error.
Yeah, let's do something that's not a predefined function. So this is saying this value is unbound because what's happening, and the PPX replacer over on the right unfortunately doesn't give us what happens if there's a type error.
Okay, yes.
So we can actually
let's
actually just jump over to AST Explorer for a second.
Brilliant.
So, and do macro add 5 with input and then input plus 5. And you see what the result is in the bottom right is some number equals input plus 5. It didn't do the variable replacement.
Yeah, input didn't exist. Okay.
And that's because what you're defining in the macro is the template. And everything is assumed by default to be normal code that you want to still be there when the macro has run.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because you can imagine, we're defining some variable, And so let awesome equals 10 still exists in the output because there's no evaluating going on.
Yeah, he added awesome, a variable called awesome, inside the macro body.
Yeah.
And it stays in the result. Okay, great.
I can elevate awesome to be a macro level variable by doing let percent eval, and then the reference eval double underscore awesome.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
So this is there's kind of two different scopes to be thinking about. One is the one that runs at macro time, and the other is the stuff that's in the resulting code.
Kind of blows my mind a little bit. Okay, so the arguments to the function are by default macro level arguments.
Right. Yes. All of the macro arguments are macro level.
Okay, so those are macro arguments. So the arguments that come to the right-hand side of the equal function when you're defining a macro are macro arguments. So they must be referred to in the function body, the function of the macro, with the eval dot underscore prefix.
That's right.
Great. Makes a lot of sense.
So next, let's get into something that's actually useful.
Yeah, let's do that.
And this little ion icon macro is one of the things that has been in my mind the past couple of months, because I have a file called ionicons.re in a project that I did, and it is 220 lines of basically the same code repeated after itself again and again.
It's just wrapping the ion icons React component library, it appears.
Right. So I'm pulling out individual components. There's the iOS link component. There's the MD download component. All of these, but I can't use OCaml's built-in systems for abstraction because there's no way to have a variable named module.
Yes.
Like I can't say I want to make a module and I'm going to decide on the name later, because modules are this top level they're the special thing.
Which is probably good, because if you could do that, it would melt brains a little bit.
It would also super mess with OCaml's compilation setup and make it a lot slower.
Okay, great. So that's a trade-off we're happy to make.
Right. The other thing you definitely can't do is you can't do anything fancy with the right-hand side of an external.
Ah, okay. Nothing dynamic there, yeah.
Yeah, this string literal is interpreted by BuckleScript directly. You can't do, like, let's do some string concatenation plus
yeah.
iOS link. That is invalid syntax.
That makes sense.
So I wanted a setup that would allow me to deduplicate this massive amount of code, because there's nothing different here.
I'm getting really excited right now. This is pretty great.
Yeah. So this is the Ionicon macro. Basically, I just copied in, again, with the template idea, I copied in directly one of them, and then I changed out the two things that needed to change.
Which are the icon name.
The name of the module, which I wanted to be dynamic, and the require path of the component.
Wow. So what Jared has here is on the left-hand side of the equal sign, he has let percent macro dot top level, which you'll explain in a moment, I suppose, ion icon equals. So there's the left-hand side, and the right-hand side has some arguments, name and icon name. Then there's the fat arrow, which says we're going to define the body of the macro now. And inside of there, you have a square bracket percent. I already forgot what those are called.
An extension point.
An extension point that says percent str, STR, and then inside of that, you have a module definition. And the module name has eval underscore name, and then there's all the code that you talked about before, the React component, the external React component definition.
That's right.
So tell us the new stuff here.
Yeah, so macro.toplevel means the thing that I'm going to be producing is not an expression. By default, macros are I'm making an expression. But module definitions are not expressions.
Okay.
And so there's a difference in Reason and OCaml code between what's called a structure item, which is a top level thing. It can be a declaration. It can be an external. It can be a module, things like that. And then just about everything else is an expression, except, I mean, there are patterns and types. But
Yeah.
Anything inside the body of a function is an expression. And so that's the default when you're making a macro. But for if you're making a macro that needs to return a module definition, it needs to be top level.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so this %stir also means top level. I should probably change it to just be % top level for consistency's sake.
So %stir is something you wrote.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
It's short for structure, and that's the terminology used in PPX land, but it's not actually necessary.
I was like, that's a string. I thought it was a string eval thing. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, top level would make a lot more sense. And
no,
so it wouldn't be possible to do something like just infer that it's that it gets wrapped in that top level extension point because you're already doing let macro.top level.
That's right, because it's actually a change in the parser.
Okay.
Because the parser, if I put external this in an expression,
it'll parse
place,
it as
it's a parse error.
That's why you got to put it inside of an extension point.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So this is also required when you're making a top level. And
the change from stir to top level, I think, is a good change.
Right. Yeah, that'll help. And then I have eval underscore name. It's capital eval this time because module names have to be capitalized. And then in here, the other fancy thing is we've got some string interpolation.
Oh, okay.
And so this will happen. Let's see, I removed the other example of string interpolation. You just get that back.
So while you're doing that, in the right-hand side of the external definition, inside of the extension point for the structure, hopefully everyone who's listening can follow along with that. Yeah, there's the string for the JavaScript name that's being linked to, which is react-ionicon/lib/ and here we have a special $eval, and then an open curly brace icon name, and then close curly brace. And that is within the string. So this is not this is an interpolated string. This isn't like a curly brace with J in it like we're used to. This is a normal string that has that $eval inside of it.
That's right. And so it has to be this special interpolation because, like I said before, nothing other than a string literal will parse in this situation.
Makes sense.
And so, as you can see on the right, what happens is the result is React ionicon/lib/ios link in this case.
Yeah. So the so name, when you're calling it, let's talk about how this is called really quickly so that we can get an idea here.
Right.
Why don't you go down to on the left-hand side to where ion icon is called?
Yeah. And refumped makes it look weird, so I'm going to change it back.
Can you actually explain that for a moment? Why does refumped drop the outer square braces of a top level extension point, and it also drops the second %? Because it looks like when you're doing a top level extension point, it requires 2%.
That's right. So this is an aesthetic choice that somebody made about what refump should do. It was at the same time that top level decorators lost their square braces by default.
Okay. I didn't know that was a thing you could do either. So
I think that's a thing.
Oh, it looks like it's a syntax error.
Maybe it's only in okay, maybe that didn't happen. I don't know, but it was a thing that happened a year or so ago, maybe.
So in any case, the parser actually supports a top level extension point, dropping the square braces and using 1% sign.
Right.
Okay, so that's actually fine with me.
Yeah. And that's the default. I don't like it as much for this case because with the braces and everything on the same line, it looks more like a function call.
Yeah.
But so yeah, when we are calling this macro, we've got the double percent ion icon, and then the two arguments.
So you've got a tuple there, and the two arguments are not strings; they're actual names. Like you typed names uh, into the code directly. So those aren't strings. So how does that work out?
So technically, in the AST, these come out to be um, constructors of variants. So like it thinks that there's some type definition somewhere with link
Right.
or iOS link or whatever.
So that's syntactically okay. You have uppercase L link and uppercase I iOS link, and that's syntactically okay. But since you're going to be taking that out of the source at compile time and transforming the source, you can just drop those in there and it's fine.
Right. It doesn't matter that there is no actual link defined anyway.
That's really interesting. So in the macro, you have those types being cap ident. Is that a type that you made up?
So these are there are a number of different types that you can use in macros. There's int, string, float. Again, these are all constants. Also bool. And then there's ident, cap ident, long ident, and long cap ident.
Whoa, okay.
And these names are also up for debate if people have opinions about it.
So you get an identifier, a capitalized identifier.
And then the long means this is namespaced, potentially.
Oh, so like foo dot bar dot whatever.
Yeah. Or just bar. Like it doesn't have to be namespace, but it allows namespacing.
Yeah, that makes
Whereas
sense.
the first two don't allow namespacing.
Okay, great.
And so for name, I don't allow namespacing because it needs to be a module name. Okay. If I called this a long cap ident, it would be a macro compilation error, which again isn't showing up very well. But it would say, you're using this, it has to be a cap ident, not a long cap ident.
Okay. Great.
And then string interpolation will accept just about any type and do good things with it.
That's pretty amazing.
There's also expression and pattern are allowed as types. And maybe we'll get into those in a little bit.
Okay. So what over on the right-hand side then, what I see is the actual module for a link with all of the code for the React component placed inside of it, which is pretty amazing. Tell me about that weird string at the end. That's BuckleScript 5.04. What is that?
That is a signature that BuckleScript attaches to externals. Okay. So if you're looking at this in AST Explorer, you won't see that.
Okay.
Because AST Explorer doesn't actually run BuckleScript's preprocessors.
Okay.
Yet.
I see. So what we see in AST Explorer right now is basically just the exact source for the macro with the correct interpolations replaced with no weird BuckleScript string. But what we see in the editor is there's a big string full of Unicode characters
right.
that is placed after the last string in the extension point for the BuckleScript compiler.
Right.
But that doesn't hurt anything. That can be there, and it's not a problem, right?
Right. It's fine. But what we have is module link equals and module download equals created just from these two lines,
which is pretty amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah. So this is a great example of the power of having a template, dropping things in, and then OCaml is happy because you're not trying to do anything fancy at runtime. It's all done at compile time.
Now, is it okay if I throw a curveball at you here and ask, would it be possible to make the props also dynamic? So let's say I want to have, a variable set of props merged in here in this React component. So I've got, right now you have class name, font size, color, and onClick defined as props for this React component. What if I wanted to be able to do that at macro time and say, these are the prop names that I support? That would be complex, obviously, because I'd have to give the types too. But would it be possible?
Theoretically possible.
Okay,
The macro system doesn't support that yet, but it's definitely, I definitely have plans around that kind of thing.
great. Okay, cool.
Um, all right, so let's move down to this example, which is let's re-implement let anything.
Okay, so let anything, for those who haven't watched before, is a PPX that Jared wrote that basically just takes away the pain of callbacks for us. So it takes anything that it takes let percent some module name, and then on the right hand side you have an expression that returns well, let's just do this specific case of like it returns a promise. What it does is it'll take your source code and transform it so that all the code inside of the function following that let declaration gets put into a callback, so you don't at compile time, so that visually your code is flat. You have a lot of variables in scope, but at runtime you have nested callbacks, and the code just behaves like it would if you were expecting callbacks.
That's right. It's essentially the same basic thing as async await does in JavaScript.
Right.
So let's look at the async example, because we just described it. Here is the code that looks almost exactly like it would if you're using let anything. So do something async is a function. We've got let percent async text equals fetch hello, and then again percent async more equals text arrow JSON. So this is as if you were working with the JavaScript fetch API that is very promise based.
Yeah.
And if you're just doing that with nested promises, it gets really hairy. And the thing that it has compiled to on the right-hand side is using js.promise.then in all the right places. So it's just, this is the code you would have written, but it looks a lot nicer.
That's amazing. I love it.
And so the macro definition is, again, a new kind of macro, a macro.let.
Okay.
Where earlier we had plain macro, which is an expression macro, macro.toplevel, which is for module definitions primarily and externals. And then macro.let is saying, I want a macro that works as a let percent.
Okay, that makes sense.
And let macros have a predefined number of arguments and types of arguments.
Great.
Because there's a pattern, which is everything on the left-hand side of the equals. There's a value, which is everything on the right-hand side of the equals. And then the continuation, which is everything after the let, the expression that's evaluated with that pattern bound to that value.
Okay.
So we could play with this a little bit and say, like, what is the continuation?
And so right now, Jared commented out the body of the macro that existed with the js.promise.then. Inside the macro body, he had done JS then, eval pattern, then returns eval continuation, etc. He's commenting it out, and now he's showing us what it would look like if the macro just had the eval continuation in it. What would that look like?
Right. So in the continuation, it just gives the expression that's after the let binding. We don't see text anywhere because we haven't used the pattern. We don't see fetch hello anywhere because we haven't used the value.
Right. That makes sense.
And so what we're doing now is taking the pattern, the value, and continuation, dropping them into the promise.then function. And this is a really easy straight across, because promise.then takes a function which the argument is a pattern, and the body is the continuation, and then the value is the promise that's being evaluated.
It's pretty amazing, though.
To give another example of another let macro, this is with optionals. Again, we've got pattern, value, continuation, and what you want to do is you want to switch on the value, and if it's a none, you go to none. If it's some, you want to bind the pattern with the contents of the optional, and then the body that's the result is the continuation. And so now we get to have a function that is dealing with a couple of optionals. Say you're working with various config values, and they need to all be there in order for you to be able to do anything. And so this kind of does almost a similar thing to the null coalescing operator in JavaScript, where I only care about going forward if everything is the happy path.
Yes. So this is like null coalescing in JavaScript, like you said, which is actually moving forward in the approval process right now. So probably not a lot of people have used it. But if you've used Swift, this exists in Swift with the question mark and or the bang. I think you can use a bang to say like, maybe that's actually like force get. But this would be more analogous to if you've used Scala for notation in Scala, which is a monadic bind, if you know what that is. If you don't worry about it. But that's also available as do notation in Haskell. So this is kind of the same idea as all of those, right?
That's right. And so just to demonstrate a little more what is happening with this replacement, let's say, in the resulting code, we want, what if we want the nuns to be first? Just like, so that the happy path is at the very end. Let's switch this around, and you can see
amazing.
Now the nuns are first, then we have some, and the happy path is at the very end.
So what we see on the right-hand side is that the actual body of the function is compiled to two nested switch statements on the optionals that Jared is binding, so that the actual resulting expression we have in the call to the macro is has both of the option contents available in scope. And so over on the right-hand side, that's where the code we don't see that the compiler sees, that's the stuff that deals with the super nested gross switch statements.
That's right.
Gross, but kind of hard to visually parse.
Right. So this is hopefully a taste of the various things you can do with a macro. Anywhere that you have an identifier, you can do a replacement there. Maybe let's go up to the top and do something more interesting with this add 5. Let's say now this needs to be an identifier, and we're gonna bind that whatever identifier you gave us to a value, and then I don't know, do something else. And what this results to is I passed in num as the identifier, and it gives me let num equals 10. Or say I want to be producing a function, and I want the argument name to be something specific. The resulting function, if I played my cards right, I might not have played my cards right, would have num in the identifier, ideally.
Okay. Yeah. There. Did you do it? No.
So this one says I want to reference an external variable.
Wow. So this takes a reference to an external variable as part of the argument of the macro and substitutes the call to that variable inside the body of the macro, which is pretty amazing.
Right.
So let's go ahead. And
so those of you that are familiar with macro systems might be wondering about hygiene. The short answer is no. These macros are at the moment non-hygienic. I haven't messed with that at all. If you have opinions about it, let me know.
What does the hygiene mean?
Hygiene has to do with making sure that macros don't step on each other.
Ah, okay.
And so, for example, if I do let num equals 5, this is breaking hygiene, because you might have said, I expect this num to reference the num that's right here, but I've rebound that num inside the macro, and you might not have known about it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So hygienic
Yeah.
macros go through and replace any identifier that hasn't been passed in with some guaranteed to be unique thing,
Okay.
like num15, so that this behavior doesn't happen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I currently don't do anything like that. I'm not super sure that I want to, just because these are intentionally quite simple.
And sometimes simple is exactly what we're going for, just for debuggability's sake and comprehensibility. So let's say we wanted to write a macro that would make debugging or logging a value easy, right? So let's say like we wanted to log a value and also log the file and the line where that value was.
Yeah.
I won't go into we won't, like my ultimate goal would be, let's say you wanted to log an OCaml record as a JS object, but that sounds like the macro system probably isn't ready for that kind of type reflection. Is that right?
That's right. Anything that involves digging into the type system is not going to work.
Okay. This is literally just for like, I want to write some code and I don't want to like copy paste a million times. And so I just write these macros to do it.
Right. So you can do like a trace macro that is, let's see, is this gonna, so I haven't gotten into any of the fancy eval stuff yet.
Okay.
So let's do that. What if you have, so this is now going to take two arguments. One is a Boolean literal. And I'm going to do if eval log, then I'm going to do js.log on the input. Otherwise, or, you know, that just evaluates to unit, so it's fine. And now we are doing js.log. Oh, and I forgot the eval underscore. So now it will log the num and then do that +5. If I pass in false, it won't do that.
So you've modified your add5 macro to just say, to add an argument that says, should I log this or not? And you switched on the result of that macro argument. So the if eval is working at the macro
time. Yeah.
So that's why you didn't do eval underscore log. You said if eval log with no prefix. So that's actually code that's running at macro time, and
exactly.
the result is what comes out. Wow, that's pretty amazing.
That's right. And so we can also, if we're working with integer literals, we can do some comparison.
Oh, so you could do the log level, for example. So you could say like log.debug or something. Could you do? You probably can't do like switches and type constructors here, so you couldn't have like different log levels, right?
We can.
Mind blown. My mind is
so and let's see, this might work, this might not. Let's see. And no, that won't work.
So Jared's now trying to figure out how we could pass in some kind of variant or polymorphic variant as the log argument to this add5 macro to see if we could say, you know, if the log level is error, then go ahead and log this, otherwise don't.
So what we can do is pass in a string and switch on that.
Yeah, but you couldn't pass in an identifier.
Right. So, and if we want to make it like act like a variant, we can, you know, make it fail if you pass in something that's not expected. So there is an exhaustiveness check.
Okay. Is that supposed to be doing a compiler error right now?
It is. You can't see it very well. Again, the reporting here is a little messed up.
Okay.
But yeah, so you can do switches, you can do ifs. I'm planning to support something like a polyvariant type, so that you could do error and that would work.
Okay. Yeah. Ideally, it would be like at some place in your code, you've set the actual log level, and then these logs will only log if it's greater than or equal to the log level that's globally set or something like
that. Right, but you can't have runtime values interacting with macro time values.
Yes, that makes sense. So what your macro would actually do a runtime switch, not a macro time switch. So they wouldn't be compiled out at compile time unless you had like if you wanted to say like modify your source code so that you had the node end equal to when the node end is production, I actually like put macro in my source that says that the log level is X or Y. Then
exactly
pre-compilation, you could go through and strip out at compile time all of your non-irrelevant logging code.
That's right.
That's cool.
Some other fun things that I've added. Let's see. You can do like let's get an end variable.
Whoa. Okay, so Jared just said inside the macro, let editor equals %eval env editor. And on the right-hand side, it's subbed in his environment variable value for his editor, which is nvim, or for neovim. So that's actually looking at your current runtime environment at compilation time and dropping those values into this compiled source.
That's right.
That's awesome. So you could definitely use your node env there to see.
Right.
Wow. So in that case, what you could do is if you wanted to set up your debug logging macro here, you could set your debug log level in the environment and your compile time environment, and it would strip out any logs that weren't relevant at compile time. So you couldn't like at runtime go ahead and change the log level. You'd have to change that at compile time. So you'd change your environment variable, redo a build, and then deploy, and you could change your log level.
That's right. Now, another thing you want to be careful about is this does violate, this does violate some caching assumptions that BuckleScript makes.
Okay.
Or that OCaml makes, right? Because if you just rerun BuckleScript with the node environment set to something else, BuckleScript will say, I don't need to recompile anything. I've already compiled it.
Okay,
I haven't changed any of the source.
It's not detecting your env.
Right, so you'd need to clean and then rebuild.
That makes sense.
So one of the things that this this can do, I've imagined like let's do a let's see, like a platform macro that takes platforms and then does let's see, like some platform, let's say it's JS, and so then you would use this with JS to 10 and Windows to 20. So, and this is getting a little fancy here, and it might not like what I've done, but basically the platform dot select from React Native, where you can say I want that this is conditional compilation on the host platform. Right. Okay. So if I'm going to JavaScript, I want one thing. if I'm going to Windows, I want something else.
Right. Yeah.
And this could get environmental variable that is, if there's a platform name here, and
so basically,
and it would pull out the
platform,
the expression from the appropriate platform.
Yeah, that's way cool. I wouldn't be needing it probably, but like you said, like it's getting pretty fancy. But that's so like if there were code that you wanted stripped out at compile time on that specific platform, so it wasn't hanging around, then you could use that switch to say, oh, I'm on Windows, so I'm not even going to include that Unix path compilation stuff or whatever.
Right, because it also might be invalid. Like that module might not exist if you're
Yes.
compiling to JavaScript or compiling to native.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this is a potential for doing more cross-platform code.
Well, this is great. So there's already a lot that you can do with this. It's very flexible. There's a lot to come, it sounds like, as well. So kind of what are the future plans here?
Yeah, so future plans include making supporting arguments. So function arguments are their own special thing. And specifically allowing you to have multiple things. Like I want to spread in, like what does it mean to spread in these arguments? From like that, this would be invalid syntax. But having some kind of an indicator, also being able to do macro time mapping and reducing over an array of something.
Wow, yeah, that sounds amazing.
So just some of the things that are a little bit more complicated, and it would still be nice to be able to do them without reaching for the full PPX.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. And then would it ever be possible to do type reflection? Probably not, because this runs before the type system runs, right?
That's right. So one of the things that can be done is I mean, so you're a big fan of Deco, right?
Yeah, Deco is a PPX that allows us to generate encoders and decoders, JSON decoders and decoders, based on the type that is written out in the record. So you can just put a record, this is what Jared's doing on the screen right now, write a record, and then decorate it at the top with @deco, and it goes ahead and it produces a decoder that uses the field on the left-hand side as the field name in the JSON, and the type on the right-hand side as the type name. So you don't actually have to do type reflection, is what Jared's saying here, because you've got the names of the types on the right-hand side, right?
Right. So I'm not quite sure how I would want to do it, but I would like to support. So some people, when I announced this, said, "Oh, I'd love to be able to make custom PPX deriving," which is a similar thing to what Deco is doing, where I want to produce some functions that operate on this type automatically.
Right.
And I haven't yet come up with an API that would be flexible enough and easy to use, but it's something that I'd love to support.
You'd have to somehow accept like a type definition inside of your macro arguments or something like that, right? And it would give you an array or a map or a JS object, not a JS object, but like an OCaml object with the field names and their values or something like that, right?
Right.
And then you'd have to be able to support iterating over them and doing something with them.
Yeah, or it's possible that there would be like a macro.deriving that you define, and all you do is you say, if I have a tuple type, this is how you turn it into X. If I have a normal type constructor, this is how I turn it into Y. And so you just kind of are pattern matching on the kinds of things that can show up on the right hand side.
Yeah.
Um,
You'd have to somehow like produce values for all of those types. So
exactly.
you would say, oh, this is what deriving supports, and these are the values. And that's kind of how derived generic, I believe, works in Haskell when you're using their generic deriving. Is basically you just say like they've implemented a bunch of stuff for the basic types, strings, tuples, lists, etc. And your type, which is almost always just a concatenation of those other types. If you just say, hey, derive generic, they can actually generate a compound decoder and encoder and show or whatever, because all of those base constructors exist.
Exactly.
That would be brilliant, because then if you did your own macro.deriving, you could say, this is how you convert all these basic types to JSON, and then it would do it for you.
Right.
Or this is how you convert it to a JS log string or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Which is way cool, because you could support different JSON formats. You could do all kinds of stuff there.
That's right.
You could do serialization to protobufs instead of JSON, all kinds of stuff. So that's kind of the ideas for the future. That sounds awesome, Jared. How can people help and support you?
So definitely try it out. If you go to astexplorer-macros.surge.sh, we'll put that in the show notes. You can you can try the macro, any of the examples we've done here, and see what the resulting code is. If you have a PPX that you love, or you've always wanted to make one but it was too hard, send me those examples on Twitter, so that I can know what are the things that people are wanting to make.
Okay, so reach out to Jared on Twitter and give him your ideas for macros. Go try it out yourself. I'm just reiterating what Jared said in case you weren't listening. And also, please reach out to us to let us know if this episode was helpful to you. Did you like the screencast format? Did you listen to it without watching, and were you totally lost? We need some feedback to know if we should do these again in the future or if we should avoid them. So please reach out to either of us on Twitter. My name on Twitter is, I believe, at Mr. Murphy Tweets. Jared's is at Jared Lee. Is that right, Jared? Or is it at Jared Forsyth?
At Jared Forsyth on Twitter, yep.
At Jared Forsyth. So at Mr. Murphy Tweets, at Jared Forsyth, or you can email us at Murphy or Jared at reason.town, I believe.
That's right.
And I don't know if my email's set up, but if not, Jared will get it anyway. So that's good. And that's it. Thank you, everybody. And please, if you have questions or comments, also write to us. And if you have a moment, we'd love a rating on iTunes.
Thank you very much.
Have a great night or day. Bye.